The day my grandfather died, the world called me lucky. Lucky to inherit the fortune. Lucky to bear the Marin name. Lucky to stand on the ashes of a legacy that was older than I was. But luck, I've learned, is just a prettier word for target. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. I'm Elena Marin, 20 years old, and until 6 months ago, I didn't exist to my parents. That's not melodrama, that's math. 20 years alive, maybe 4 birthdays acknowledged. No calls, no visits, just silence. The kind that stretches so long, you start mistaking it for peace. When I turned 18, my father sent an email that said, "Congratulations on adulthood. Make us proud." That was it. No love, no signature, just obligation in 12 words. If it hadn't been for my grandfather, I don't think I would have made it through. Arthur Marin, businessman, philanthropist, self-made giant. The kind of man people either worshipped or feared. But to me, he was the only person who spoke softly in a family built on arrogance. He used to tell me, "You were born into noise, Elena. Learn to listen through it." He was teaching me more than how to listen. He was teaching me how to survive. When I was 19, I moved into the guest house on his estate. I was studying accounting at university, working part-time at a cafe, trying to build a life that didn't depend on anyone's last name. He'd come by some evenings with tea and say, "You're too smart to be working for tips." And I'd laugh, says the man who started sweeping factory floors. He'd grin. Exactly. That's how I know. He wasn't just my grandfather. He was my compass. The only person who looked at me and didn't see a reminder of my parents' failure. When he died, I felt the axis of my world tilt. But before I could even grieve, the phone calls started. The first one came the night after the funeral. My mother's voice. Too calm, too sweet. "Elena, darling, we need to talk about the estate." It was the first time she'd called me in 3 years. I said nothing. I just listened. The silence on my end must have made her nervous because her tone shifted. "I think your grandfather would want us to handle this as a family." That word, family, felt foreign coming from her. "I'll handle it," I said, and hung up. I thought that was the end of it, but greed is patient. It doesn't knock, it seeps in through cracks. A month later, I got a call from the family lawyer. "Elena," he said carefully, "did you authorize any withdrawals from your grandfather's trust account?" I hadn't. He sent over the documents, and there it was, $250,000 gone, signed off under my grandfather's name. Except I knew that signature. I'd seen it copied before, on letters my mother used to forge when she wanted his approval for something. I felt the blood drain from my face. That was the moment I stopped being his grieving granddaughter and became his avenger. I went to his study, searching for clues. He'd always been meticulous with records. Every penny, every donation, every transaction, written down in his ledgers. They were still there, stacked neatly on the shelves. The last one ended abruptly, mid-sentence, 3 days before he died. But in the margins, he'd scribbled something strange. Numbers, symbols, letters. A pattern that didn't make sense, until I noticed they matched his account IDs. He'd left me a code. The deeper I looked, the clearer it became. My parents had been siphoning money for years, small amounts spread across dozens of fake charities and shell accounts. They must have thought he'd never notice, or that he'd be too old to care. But he'd noticed, and he'd left me everything I needed to expose them. By the time the case reached court, the story had already made the rounds. Harris turns against her parents. They made me sound like a villain, but villains are born of neglect. When I walked into the courtroom that morning, my mother rolled her eyes. That same dismissive flicker I remembered from childhood dinners, the one that meant you're not worth the energy it takes to look at you. My father didn't even meet my eyes. The judge read the charges: fraud, embezzlement, forgery. The defendants, Diane and Richard Marin. The accuser, their daughter. For a moment, the whole room froze. Then my mother smirked. "So this is how you repay family?" she whispered as I passed. "No," I said quietly. "This is how I repay truth." They tried to paint me as ungrateful. The defense lawyer said I was manipulated by grief. He asked how I could be sure the ledgers were authentic if my grandfather hadn't simply made a mistake. I opened the folder on the stand and handed him copies of emails, bank records, and digital logs, all traced back to my parents. "Arthur Marin may have been old," I said, "but he was never careless." The courtroom went silent. He tried again. "Miss Marin, these accusations are serious. Do you understand what it means to accuse your own parents?" "Yes," I said. "It means they finally have to face the kind of accountability they've always avoided." He didn't ask me another question. During recess, I stood in the hallway, staring at the rain sliding down the courthouse windows. My reflection looked strange, older, maybe, harder. Detective Marlowe, the investigator who'd taken my case seriously from the beginning, approached. "You doing okay?" he asked. "I'm not sure." "You're holding up better than most." "It doesn't feel like winning." He nodded. "Justice rarely does." That night, I couldn't sleep. I wandered through the estate until I found myself in his study again. The air smelled faintly of paper and cedarwood. I sat in his old chair and opened one of his letters, the one he'd written me for my birthday last year. "My dear Elena, you've got the Marin fire, but not the Marin pride. Keep it that way. Pride builds empires. Humility keeps them standing. Remember that silence is a weapon, but truth is armor." I folded the letter back into its envelope and felt the weight of it in my chest. He'd known. Somehow, he'd always known what was coming. The verdict came the next morning. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, lawyers, strangers waiting to feast on someone else's tragedy. On the charges of embezzlement and fraud, the judge said, we find the defendants guilty. My parents didn't move. My mother's expression barely changed. My father exhaled, shaking his head. My mother leaned toward me, her voice like venom. "You'll regret this. You'll die alone, Elena, just like your grandfather." I looked at her for a long time before answering. "He didn't die alone," I said. "I was there." That silenced her in a way nothing else ever had. After the courtroom emptied, I stayed behind. The echoes of footsteps faded, and for the first time in years, there was peace. I sat where I'd been testifying hours before, staring at the wooden grain of the witness table. It reminded me of the desk in my grandfather's study, the same color, the same quiet strength. He used to say, "The truth doesn't shout, Elena. It just waits for people to stop lying." I'd finally heard it. People thought I'd be elated after winning, but all I felt was exhaustion. Revenge doesn't bring closure. It only clears the smoke so you can see the wreckage. But beneath the wreckage, something new can grow. I sold half of what I inherited, the cars, the jewelry, the vacation properties. I used the money to start a foundation in my grandfather's name. scholarships for students in financial trouble, grants for young entrepreneurs who'd been told they'd never amount to anything. I think he would have liked that. As for the rest of the inheritance, I kept the estate. I couldn't let go of the house that had kept me safe. Sometimes I still hear his footsteps in the hall, his voice telling me to sit up straighter, to keep my chin high. Months later, I visited him. The cemetery was quiet, the grass trimmed, the wind gentle. I knelt beside his headstone and placed his old fountain pen at his base. "You were right," I whispered. "I survived the wolves." I stayed there for a while, listening to the wind through the trees. It sounded almost like a sigh of relief. He'd told me once, money doesn't change people, it just reveals them. He was right. All I did was show the world who my parents really were. Sometimes I still think about that last dinner we ever had together. I was 20, sitting across from him at the long oak table. He looked tired that night, older somehow, but when I asked how he was feeling, he smiled. "Old age is a privilege," he said. "Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for surviving long enough to earn it." Then he looked at me for a long moment and said, "When I'm gone, they'll come for what isn't theirs. Let them. Just remember, you're sharper than their teeth." At the time, I thought he meant emotionally. I didn't realize he was leaving me a warning. Now, when people ask if I hate them, I tell the truth. No, I don't hate my parents. Hate would mean they still mattered. What I feel is simpler. Detachment. They made their choices, and I made mine. They chose greed. I chose truth. They lost everything. I found peace. It isn't triumph that fills me, it's quiet. The kind that comes when the noise finally stops, when the ghosts are finally still. I used to think blood defined you. Now I know better. Blood doesn't make a family. Love does. Loyalty does. And both of those died long before my grandfather did. Every morning, I walk past his portrait in the hall. His eyes, steady, proud, amused, follow me like they always did. "Morning, Grandpa," I say softly. Sometimes, if the sunlight hits just right, I swear I can hear him answer. And in that silence, the good kind, the kind that means peace, I realize something. They tried to use me. They tried to twist me into their reflection, but I didn't inherit their emptiness. I inherited his strength. And that, more than any fortune, is the legacy I'll never let them steal.